Hello, welcome to lesson 13.7a. I've entitled this video, Like Dust in the Wind. This video is going to cover pages 834 to 839. Life during the Depression. The Great Depression ruined the lives of numerous Americans who lost their jobs, their homes, and their savings. Hundreds of thousands of farmers and others on the Great Plains suffered the additional burden of having to flee the land that had sustained them. Many would never return. The Dust Bowl. During much of the 1930s, states from Texas to the Dakotas suffered a severe drought. One region in the central Great Plains was especially hard hit. The topsoil dried out. High winds carried the soil away in blinding dust storms. As a result, this area became known as the Dust Bowl. So question number one, what was the Dust Bowl? This was the horrible environmental catastrophe that happened during the Great Depression, where some states in the 1930s had a severe drought, and you couple that with the way that they had done some poor farming practices, and a lot of the topsoil, the very topsoil that we use to grow crops, just blew away in the wind. Devastating. Causes of the Dust Bowl. Dust storms buried farmhouses, fences, and even trees over large areas of the plains. People put shutters over doors and windows, but the dust blew in anyway. Even food crunched when it was chewed. One storm blew dust from Oklahoma to Albany, New York. A Kansas farmer sadly reported that he sat by his window counting the farms go by. What caused the disaster? Years of overgrazing by cattle and plowing by farmers destroyed the grasses that once held the soil in place. The drought of the 1930s and high winds did the rest. Question number two, what were the causes of the Dust Bowl? Well, overgrazing by cattle, plowing by farmers, destroying the grasses, and therefore, if there aren't grasses, it can't hold the soil, so all you need is one drought to happen. When the drought happens, whoosh, it's all gone. Here we see a picture of the Dust Bowl. The Dust Bowl was caused by a prolonged drought and overfarming that left the land barren. Huge dust storms called black blizzards occurred as the wind carried dust and soil into the air. The storms caused devastating erosion of the land. Here we see another picture. Vast erosion and dry conditions left much of the farmland unfertile in states across the nation's midsection. Some farms were so heavily covered by the eroded soil that they were barely recognizable. Effects of the Dust Bowl. Hardest hit by the drought and dust storms were poor farmers in Oklahoma and other Great Plains states. Thousands of these Okies packed their belongings into cars and trucks and headed west. They became migrant workers, people who moved from one region to another in search of work. They hoped to find jobs in the orchards and farms of California, Oregon, or Washington. Once they reached the West Coast, the migrants faced a new hardship. They were not wanted. Local citizens feared that the newcomers would take away their jobs. Sometimes angry crowds blocked the highways and forced the migrants to go elsewhere. Those migrants who did find work were paid little. So now we can answer a couple questions. Which states were hit the hardest by the Dust Bowl for number three? Well, it's definitely the farmers in Oklahoma, Arkansas, and other Great Plains states. Number four, who were the Okies? The Okies were the people that left Oklahoma and other Great Plains states. They packed their belongings in the cars and trucks, and they went to the West Coast, especially like California, Oregon, and Washington. Number five, what is a migrant worker? That is a person who moves from one region to another in search of work. Number six, during the Dust Bowl, where did the migrant workers move to? They moved to California, Oregon, or Washington. Number seven, when the migrant workers arrived, what new problem did they encounter? They encountered the problem that they were not welcome. Local citizens did not want these migrant workers there, most for the reason for they were afraid they'd take their job. Here in this picture, many farm families vacated the Dust Bowl region. As one Kansas man said, the land just blew away. We had to go somewhere. Approximately 2.5 million people were driven from the Plains states during the Dust Bowl era. Here we see a picture of the Dust Bowl and where it hit the worst, and also you can see the movement of the people. So basically the migrants headed either west, especially to the California region, and you can see in some places they actually moved east, but they had to get out of the Dust Bowl region. Just too devastating. Many farm families headed west to California. They lived in makeshift homes that provided little shelter and no conveniences. Many were not welcome as they competed with others already struggling for work. Here we see a picture of the black blizzard, the dust storms. Oh my goodness. Here we see another picture. Just imagine what that would be like. Here we see a picture from Beaver, Oklahoma, or near it. This is an amazing storm. It almost looks like CGI that it's been put into, it looks like one of those parts in the movie like The Mummy or something where the dust is coming, but that's actually a real picture. And in this picture, in 1935, this was taken by a Kodak camera. This was in Colorado on Easter Sunday. I mean, it looks like one of those movies, a superhero movie. That's how bad it looked. Here we see a picture from 1934 in South Dakota, another example of a black blizzard. Here we see a picture from 1936, farmer and son, dust storms in Oklahoma. Here we see a farm foreclosure sale circa 1933. Now, farmers could barely make a living, causing many to leave their homes for the West. That was an effect of the Dust Bowl. Here we see a farm very close to home here. This is in Iowa, 1933. So basically what's happened is the farm is being foreclosed on. I'm guessing these people are there maybe to buy the farm at low price. Here we see a picture of families on the road with all their possessions, circa 1935. They're taking what they have and they're heading out west. Here we see some farmers whose topsoil blew away and they're joining the sod caravans, the Okies, on Route 66 to California. Here we see a gentleman all by himself on the California highway, 1935. Here we see two, I'm guessing friends, and they are making their way. We estimate perhaps 2.5 million people abandoned their homes in the South and the Great Plains during the Great Depression and went on the road. Here we see a picture of a migrant family looking for work in the pea fields of California, 1935. Here we see an Oklahoma squatter for 3 years near Bakefield, California, 1935. Migrant farmers from Arkansas became known as Okies, while the people from Oklahoma were known as Okies. This is a young Oklahoma mother, age 18, penniless, stranded in California. How did the Depression affect women? Traditional roles took on added importance during the Depression. Homemakers had to stretch family budgets to make ends meet. Some women took in laundry to earn extra money. Others took in boarders to help pay the rent. Wives also found that unemployed husbands sometimes needed more nurturing to feel worthwhile. Working women faced special problems during the Depression. If jobs were available, employers hired men before they would hire women. In order to spread jobs around, the federal government refused to hire a woman if her husband had a job. So question number 8, what are some ways that women were affected by the Great Depression? Well, sometimes if they were a homemaker, they had to stretch the budget to make ends meet. Sometimes they did extra laundry to make some extra money, or took in extra people to pay some rent. Sometimes they had to be very compassionate to their husbands if they were out of work to make them feel that they did have worth. And then sometimes women also got jobs during the Great Depression. However, notice that if jobs were available, employers would hire the men before they would hire the women. So women faced an extra amount of discrimination during the Great Depression. Working women. Despite such obstacles, millions of women earn wages in order to support themselves and their families. During the 1930s, the number of married women in the workforce increased by 52%. Educated women took jobs as secretaries, school teachers, and social workers. Other women earned livings as maids, factory workers, and seamstresses. Some women workers struck for better pay. In San Antonio, Texas, at least 80% of the pecan shellers were Mexican-American women. When employers lowered their pay, a young woman, Emma Tanyanyuka, I don't know if I got that right, organized the shellers and led them off the job. Tanyanyuka said later, quote, I had a basic faith in the American idea of freedom and fairness. I felt something had to be done. So question 9, how did the Great Depression affect working women? Well, the number of married women increased in the workforce by 52%. So a lot of the women who had been working at home, if they could find a job, whether they be as secretaries, school teachers, social workers, maids, factory workers, or seamstresses, or other jobs, they found, hey, I got to do what I got to do. The First Lady takes a stand. Eleanor Roosevelt created a new role for the First Lady. Acting as the president's, quote, eyes and ears, she toured the nation. She visited farms and American Indian reservations and traveled deep into a coal mine. She talked to homemakers, studying the condition of their clothing on the wash line to measure how well they were doing. In this way, she became a spokesperson for Americans all over the country. Question 10. How did Eleanor Roosevelt change the role of the First Lady? Well, she took a much more active role. She became the president's eyes and ears. She toured the nation, trying to show that not just her husband, but she as well, was empathetic towards their cause, their struggles, their hopes, and sometimes their failures. The First Lady did more than just aid the president. She used her position to speak out for women's rights, as well as other issues. In her newspaper column, My Day, she called on Americans to live up to the goal of equal justice for all. By speaking out on social issues, Eleanor Roosevelt angered some people. However, many other Americans admired her strong stands. You know, not everybody likes a strong-willed person, and at this time, Eleanor Roosevelt felt that while some Americans liked what she was saying, there were others who were like, oh, what is she saying? She's not the president. But most people appreciated the First Lady not only standing up for Americans, but also speaking out her mind on social justice. And in one case, I actually brought this over from the old textbook because I thought this was such a great story. Americans in 1939 denied Marian Anderson, this African-American singer, to sing in Constitution Hall just because she was African-American. And Mrs. Roosevelt's like, oh, no, 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 you don't go there. And so she actually arranged for a concert to be held for Marian at Lincoln Memorial. So think about the symbolism that Marian Anderson got to sing right there with good old Abe Lincoln staring in the background. So think about the ironic nature of Constitution Hall denying an opera singer the chance to sing simply because of her skin color. But then notice what Eleanor Roosevelt did. She said this is unacceptable, and so she set up a concert where many more people were able to hear Marian Anderson. So the crowd was bigger because there was a wide open space. So good for Eleanor Roosevelt and good for Marian Anderson. Just goes to show you the time period that we lived in back in 1939. And here's a couple of points about Eleanor Roosevelt. She was born Anna Eleanor Roosevelt, niece of Theodore Roosevelt and fifth cousin, once removed of Franklin. One of her and Franklin's 6 children died as an infant. While Franklin was first ill, she kept the Roosevelt name in the news by advocating for social reforms and leading a women's delegation at the 1924 Democratic Convention. Ever gracious and charming, she felt equally at ease among immigrants, labor leaders, veterans, and the unemployed. In 1946, a year after Franklin's death, she continued to serve the United States as a diplomat at the newly formed United Nations in New York City. Eleanor Roosevelt. African Americans face hard times. When the Great Depression hit, African American workers were often the first to lose their jobs. By 1934, black workers were suffering a 50% unemployment rate, more than twice the national average. Often they were denied public works jobs. Some charities even refused to serve African Americans at centers giving out food to the needy. Eleanor Roosevelt and advocates urged the president to improve the situation of African Americans. The president responded to their needs. For example, thousands of young African American men learned a trade through the Civilian Conservation Corps. So question number 11, how did the Great Depression hit African Americans harder than white Americans? Well, first of all, they were the first ones fired and the last ones hired. So many times they found it very hard, even worse than it had been in the Great Depression, to get a job. So notice, while the unemployment rate in 1933-34 was close to 25%, for black workers it was up to 50%. And they were denied public works jobs, and sometimes charities even didn't want to give them food. So you were facing racism and, on top of that, discrimination in the Great Depression time period. Very tough. In aiding African Americans, Roosevelt won their support for the Democratic Party. The president invited African American leaders to the White House to advise him. These unofficial advisors became known as the Black Cabinet. They included Robert C. Weaver, a Harvard-educated economist, and Marion McLeod Bethune, a well-known Florida educator. Roosevelt appointed Bethune to head the National Youth Administration's Division of Negro Affairs. She was the first African American to head a government agency. Often, Roosevelt followed the advice of the Black Cabinet. However, when African American leaders pressed the president to support an anti-lynching law, he refused. He feared that by doing so, he would lose the support of Southerners in Congress for his New Deal programs. Many black leaders called on African Americans to unite to obtain their civil rights, the rights due to all citizens. African Americans used their votes, won higher-level government jobs, and kept up pressure for equal treatment. Slowly, they made a few gains. However, the struggle for civil rights would take many more years. So now we can answer a couple of questions. Number 12, how was Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt able to get African Americans to switch from voting for the Republican Party? Remember, that was the party that had freed the slaves, to voting for the Democratic Party. Remember, that had once been the party of the KKK. Well, they did it by, when the Great Depression happened, Roosevelt won their support by inviting African American leaders into the White House, having the black cabinet to help him with advice, and showing African Americans that the Democratic Party would care. And this is a remarkable change. For decades, African Americans had solely voted for the Republican Party for two reasons, as I mentioned. Number one, the Republican Party was the party of Lincoln that had freed the slaves. And number two, the Democratic Party had once supported the KKK. So it's an amazing turn of events that starts in the 1930s with FDR and would continue all the way into the 1960s. So at some point, if you look at more recent polls, the Democratic Party has a firm control on the African American vote. But, as we've learned from history, it doesn't always have to be that way. Number 13, what was the Black Cabinet? The Black Cabinet was the unofficial advisors that were African Americans that helped give advice to President Roosevelt. Number 14, what are civil rights? Civil rights are the rights due to all a country's citizens. How did other Americans weather the Depression? The hard times of the Great Depression created fear and insecurity among many Americans. These feelings sometimes erupted in discrimination and hostility toward Americans with different ethnic backgrounds. Mexican Americans. By the 1930s, Mexican Americans worked in many cities around the country. A large number, however, were farm workers in the West and Southwest. There, they faced discrimination in education and jobs, and at the polls. In good times, employers had encouraged Mexicans to move north and take jobs in factories or on farms. When hard times struck, however, many Americans wanted Mexicans to be sent back to their original country. More than 400,000 people were rounded up and sent to Mexico. Some of them were American citizens. Question number 15. What negative emotions sometimes created discrimination and hostility towards Americans with different ethnic backgrounds during the Great Depression? That would be fear and insecurity. And those feelings can often lead people to do things they wouldn't normally do. Question 16. How did the Great Depression impact Mexican Americans? Well, many Americans at that time looked at them with discrimination, or treated them with discrimination, or treated them poorly at jobs, at the polls, and many Mexicans were asked to move back to Mexico. And you can see more than 400,000 were rounded up and sent back to Mexico. Asian Americans. Some Americans resented Chinese, Japanese, and Filipino workers who competed with them for scarce jobs. Sometimes violence against Asians erupted. Responding to pressure, the government sought to reduce the number of Asians in the United States. In 1935, FDR signed a law that provided free transportation for Filipinos who agreed to return to the Philippines and not come back. Wow. Number 17, how did the Great Depression impact Asian Americans? Well, they were resented many times by Americans who were competing for scarce jobs. You'll notice there's a common theme here. When you are competing for jobs, Americans are very quick to forget that we are a land of immigrants, and they get very quickly. American Indians. In 1924, Congress had granted all Indians citizenship. Still, most Indians continued to live in deep poverty. President Roosevelt encouraged new policies toward American Indians. In the 1930s, Congress passed a series of laws that have been called the Indian New Deal. The laws gave Indian nations greater control over their own affairs. The president chose John Collier, a longtime defender of American Indian rights, to head the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Collier ended the government policy of breaking up American Indian landholdings. In 1934, Congress passed the Indian Reorganization Act. It protected and even expanded landholdings of Indian reservations. The Roosevelt administration also strengthened American Indian governments by letting reservations organize corporations and develop their own business projects. To provide jobs during the Depression, the government set up the Indian Emergency Conservation Work Group and employed American Indians in programs of the control of topsoil erosion, irrigation, and land development. Question 19. What was the main idea or goal of the Indian New Deal? Well, it was trying to give Indian nations greater control over their own affairs. Question 20. Describe the Indian Reorganization Act. Well, the goal of this, it protected and expanded land holdings of Indian reservations. and it helped strengthen their governments by letting their reservations organize into corporations and develop their own business projects. Well, thank you very much for watching. Before we go, I have a couple of jokes over the Dust Bowl. I hope that you find them funny. What is a dust storm's favorite color? Blue. Okay, if you don't like that one, well, how about this one? What day of the week has the most powerful dust storms? Wednesday? Okay. Why aren't the dust storms laughing at my jokes right now? They aren't laughing because they have a dry sense of humor. Oh, stop, Mr. Morris. Stop already. Thank you and have a nice day.